We have an exciting agenda today. Tony, our guest speaker, and I are going to talk through some tips and tricks on board reporting. The two of us have done, and we won't disclose a number to avoid dating ourselves, but suffice to say, a lot of board packs between the two of us. So excited to talk through, hopefully, some of our learnings there and share some of them with you guys. We're going to be making, or maybe making, some forward-looking statements in the presentation today, and I just want to caution you that those carry risk, and so to please, to the extent you're making purchasing decisions, base those on the software as it exists today. With that, I'll introduce myself and our guest speaker. Tony, do you want to tell folks who you are and where you're from?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I am the manager in finance here at Malwarebytes. I've been here about nearly a year, and we have roughly about 700, 800 employees, and we focus mainly on antivirus, anti-malware.
Okay, and you can give me some tips on how to hide that notification, or should I be clicking yes every time I see a note from that?
Just click yes.
fair enough. So actually, a little known fact, Tony and I used to work together a few years back at Adaptive Insights. So we're going to talk through some best practices that we undertook, as well as some of the new things Tony is doing over at Malwarebytes today. We're going to discuss, in terms of agenda, a little bit of feedback from the field. We do a lot of surveying of CFOs and finance departments, and so we'll share some of those results with you. They should be a little surprise, as most of you on the phone are sort of living these things every day. Then we'll talk a little bit about some of what Tony set up at Malware, and then we'll spend most of the time actually demonstrating some of the tools and techniques that we both use to make things a little bit more efficient. And then we'll try to carve off a fair bit of time at the end for Q&A. But again, if something piques your interest as we go through, please drop a note into the chat window so we can make sure to get it. If we don't, just given the volume of all of the attendees today, get to every question, we'll circle back and handle those offline. So this is the report that we get back every quarter from our CFO indicator, and I'm always blown away by some of the heft and weight of the stats that come through, and that number 85% is kind of a big and terrifying one, just in terms of folks saying that while they have access to the data that they require, they spend too much time gathering, too much time confirming the accuracy, and too much time, and this is my personal pet peeve, formatting that data and seeing that. And so we'll talk today about how to streamline a lot of that gathering and then get some of those other things squared away as well, just in terms of the consistency, accuracy, and my personal favorite, the formatting. This was another response that I thought was pretty interesting in terms of where folks have the most difficulty and which reports in particular. And, you know, we talk about it being a finance audience, and, you know, naturally there's concern with the financial statements and kind of the statutory reporting. But it's interesting that isn't the biggest problem. It tends to be those two up at the top, which are the sort of QBR, the quarterly business reviews, and particularly the board packs. And I think, you know, one of the biggest reasons for that is that those packs tend to contain a big chunk of operational metrics, which in terms of the Office of Finance are sometimes a little bit harder to get a hold of. And what I mean by that is most of the financial stuff is coming directly out of the general ledger, so we have access and can navigate that data. Whereas a lot of times metrics like coming out of our CRM about customer acquisition and other things that we tend to care about can live in other source systems that we're a little bit sort of less familiar with, a little bit harder to pull all together into a single area. You know, ultimately here, and this is, you know, they pulled together some of the results of our CFO indicator survey. I think, you know, the main aim is being able to accomplish this data aggregation and formatting and consistency and making sure that we're then pushing that data out to the executives and stakeholders around the company so that everybody can be making decisions with the latest information And and in the process, making ourselves a little bit more strategic in terms of what we can add to the business, right? As opposed to just kind of grinding through the data and being copy and pasting robots. With that, Tony, I want you to tell us a little bit more about what's going on at Malware in terms of the business challenges, and then what that's meant for you in terms of being able to help them get some of their board reporting and management reporting squared away.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Tom. So I work at Malwarebytes. We have about 800 odd employees and contractors as of last month. We're headquartered out of Santa Clara, and we have almost like a Jekyll and Hyde view of the business. About half of our business, a little more than half, comes from a consumer side. And then the other side of our business is more anti-malware, antivirus for enterprises.
And Tony, which one's Jekyll and which one's Hyde? I'm curious there.
Yeah.
Or maybe, I'm not sure if you're allowed to answer that.
Yeah, maybe depending on the day, I guess. Depending on the latest fire we have to put out. So yeah, Tom, it's a little bit different from my time at Adaptive, where it was all selling to enterprise. The whole selling directly to consumers has been a little bit of a learning curve for me, sort of wrap my head around it. So as far as board reporting and just general forecasting, when I joined about 9-10 months ago, we were using Adaptive for just pulling in the actuals from NetSuite. So I built up the model for the plan for this year, so that we quickly pivoted to now we could forecast expenses and balance sheet and cash flow, et cetera. So that was a big step forward for not only the finance team, but also for the company in general.
Yeah, I think that's a good point to make, because in this webinar and the demo, we're going to focus a little bit on the reporting side, but one thing folks sometimes not ignore, but at your peril kind of thing is the more and like sort of more comprehensive you can make the application in terms of what you tackle. And what I mean by that is, okay, OpEx, headcount, but also the top line, into the bookings and kind of the more operational drivers that are underpinning that, as well as sort of just in terms of the financial statements. Hey, I've got to have not only a P&L, but forward balance sheet so I can get to cash flow. The bigger and more comprehensive the model is, then suddenly you have a larger single repository that can drive a bigger chunk of the reporting. Where I see folks sometimes not get into trouble, but just leave money on the table is they'll use the application for just a little piece, which then means in order to get a comprehensive view, now I'm back in Excel sort of piecing things, together. If I say, leave my top line model out somewhere else, then I'm kind of still back in this, piece it together type game. Tony, you shared a couple of snippets out of the application. What are we looking at here, and why'd you build all this, and what's going on?
So on the left side, actually on both sides, these are a couple different sheets that we've built here at Malwarebytes. And the goal was, focusing on the left side, is to create one sheet that has all these metrics that, say, the CEO or the CFO would want to see without forcing them to go to all these other sheets within the model, like forcing them to go to the income statement for revenue and then go to the balance sheet for cash and then go to some other sheet for headcount. Is for the big ticket important metrics or KPIs that we were going to track on a monthly, quarterly, yearly basis. I've created a sheet where they know where they can go to get those things. And on the left side of the screen, you have bookings, billings, and revenue, and there's a number of rows to the sheet that goes into the financials like OpEx, and then other balance sheet items like DSO and CapEx, and then ultimately cash flow and your ending cash balance and headcount.
Got it, yeah,
and similarly on the right side, This is, again, I mentioned before that Malwarebytes has sort of a consumer side of the house and an enterprise side of the house. And on the right side of the screen here is, obviously we want to track from a SaaS metrics perspective. We want to track, the important metrics for like gross retention, net retention, your LTV CAC ratio, your productivity per ramped reps, and to track ramped reps. So again, it's sort of these summary sheets that we've created for the senior leadership where they can go and grab some data and grab some numbers without having to click through a whole bunch of other sheets that is more, applicable for the finance team.
Yeah, and we'll when we get into the demo, we'll kind of show a live version of sort of a simplified view of this. But Tony, and I'm kind of cheating a little here because I've seen a few models in Adaptive, but at the top line there it says it's a cube. So this bookings information, the logo acquisition, gross retention, you're dimensionalizing that in some fashion. Can you talk a little bit about that? And apologies for folks on the screen that we didn't screen snap the whole thing, but Tony can kind of give you a little color. We can show some examples later.
Yeah. So on the right side of the screen, it's like you mentioned, Tom. It's a cube, and that's where we try to track bookings and retention by different dimensions, and it could be our different channels. So on the enterprise side, we get our bookings through 2 or 3 different channels. So you can look at retention or LTV CAC by any one of those channels, but we also have like by geo, so you can see what the EMEA market is doing versus the North America market, and that all comes through this cube where it's kind of like a big pivot table in a way where you can filter and look at different specific numbers or metrics by those different dimensions. So it's really helpful to be able to get some detail behind different markets or different channels that are see how they're performing for us.
Gotcha, makes sense. And then one other thing I want to pick a little bit on is kind of the data source. So some of this stuff looks like new logos, that kind of.
Yeah.
Where is that coming? Is that Salesforce data or what's going on?
Yeah. So again, right. So there's different channels, and some of those channels, our biggest channel is going to be through selling to enterprises, and that's going to come through Salesforce. So you're only as good as your Salesforce data. So it's a big challenge, and I'm sure it is for a lot of people on the phone, is to get that Salesforce data sorted out and in line, which makes for more believable and reliable numbers on the other side. But we also get some bookings through NetSuite as well. So it's a little bit of a mishmash of where we get the data, but a lot of it's through Salesforce.
Got it. And something like if I go a little further down there, sales reps and rep count, where is that out of?
So that's both actuals and for the forecast is we again, similar to, I'm sure, a lot of people on the phone, where if you were to hire me as a sales rep today, it's going to take me a long time to ramp up, considering I've never done sales before. But yeah, that's the view.
We've got a good training program.
Yeah. So you hire me as a sales rep today, and it might take 6-9 months for me to ramp up. And that's a view to get a view of how many ramped reps you have, not just sales reps.
Gotcha. That makes sense. Okay. So Tony, you've pulled all this data. You have this big fat model that you've built out in Adaptive here. You've summarized it into a couple of key metric sheets that execs can kind of self-serve. What happened now? How does this get out to the board? Where does it go from kind of here?
Yeah, so for our board reporting and our monthly operating review, we're a heavy user of Office Connect, and that is super helpful because it's an add-in to Excel where you just pull different accounts like revenue, you pull different time periods like fiscal year 19, fiscal year 20, or different months, and once it's in that Excel format, you can then do some calculations on that year-to-year growth or variance year-to-year, and then but you can also do format different colors or fonts that you might want to put in your board deck or monthly or quarterly reporting. In addition, you can make charts like a revenue chart, like a line chart or a pie chart that you might want to put into your board deck. So it's basically linking this Office Connect Excel. It's linking the data in the model to your final product, whether that be some sort of PowerPoint presentation or some sort of output in Excel format to be consumed by your board members or your senior leadership. And it's helpful because once you sort of sort out what the board slides are going to look like each time, what they're used to in the past and what they expect in the future. Once you have sort of that format sorted out, then we as a finance team, we spend a lot of time making sure that the numbers are right and the metrics look good and reasonable from a forecast perspective, so that the actual putting data to PowerPoint slides becomes that much easier when you have a tool that just pulls data from the model and then makes a line chart automatically with those numbers. It takes out a lot of that, chart building gymnastics, and makes us, frees up some of our time to do analysis rather than, chart building.
Gotcha. Yeah, makes sense. And we'll show folks some of that in a minute. Before we get into that, I want to kind of run through just a few of the sort of best practices. And most of the folks on the audience will know these and sort of acknowledge them. I think some of the exercise is more about just the discipline to kind of stick with them. So for folks out there, feel free to download some of the CFO indicators as well as this pack, and sort of, you go to your organization and kind of say, hey, look, we've talked to literally hundreds of folks. This is the way to do it. And so if you need help pushing back, sometimes you can kind of point to those sort of resources. First one, pretty obvious in terms of avoiding the wall of numbers. So not every last detail of the financials needs to be on there. It's about getting to kind of, the punchlines about what we need to tell them and kind of what they need to know to move on. I think most importantly, and this one kind of addresses a lot of the other ones. And what I mean by that is if you can get the pre-read out in a timely fashion, that means that you don't necessarily need to belabor all of the detailed financial review in the actual meeting. And let me say that again. When the pre-read goes out early, you don't have to go through the pack in the meeting. You can focus on some of those critical elements. And that, honestly, my entire career, I've never had the board pack be anything other than an 11th hour scramble, which means, when we say get it out in, ahead of time, that means, sending it the night before literally at the 11th hour. That's not sending it out ahead of time. Post joining Adaptive, I'm sort of delighted to report that, this was finally a spot where we had the process down efficient enough that the board pack could actually go out days before, which gives board members time to actually read it, which is really remarkable because then that changes the dynamic of the meeting from kind of a surprise, here are the numbers, autopsy, to actually they've had time to digest it and are sort of talking about it. Tony, any comments on getting the pre-reads out in a timely fashion?
So, Tom, we do the same thing. We try and get the material out to the board of directors a couple of days before, and I just totally agree with you that getting those the board slides to them a couple days early, they can digest it, and when they come to the meeting, they can go on to more important strategic debate, or they can just focus on the one or two problems or issues that were in the pre-read. It just makes everyone's time more efficient once they get to the board meeting.
Yeah, and absolutely. Underline it, circle it in red. Days, that's days with an S, because it has to get out early, and that will alleviate a lot of the other problems around having too much detail and throwing that up and forcing folks to choke on that. And this, kind of hand in hand, right? You want to include the visuals, make this thing compelling. These are our works of art. This is the final product. It's not simply enough just to demote something to, an appendix. That doesn't really solve the problem. If you're sort of, presenting it, on the spot fashion and people haven't had time to kind of go through and digest it. And Tony, this was something you mentioned as well, consistency, right? I think there's constantly a tension of, hey, my board always, there's a different ask every quarter and every month, and et cetera, and that creates a lot of one-off, and it's difficult to sort of standardize on a template. It really is an exercise in a little bit of discipline to get at least, and there's always going to be some exceptions of some things that are unique and one-off, but at least for sort of the 80% of it, you want to get to a template that's repeatable, that people are used to seeing, that they recognize, that they can kind of go through and are expecting it. Any thoughts there, Tony, on the consistency and repeatability? Any tricks?
Yeah, so that's for our board reporting and also for our monthly operating reviews. That's a process. So we are trying to be more consistent and trying to sort out the format and the key 10 or 12 slides. So it's a process, as they say. We're still there. We're still in that process.
Yeah, and again, guys, nothing in here is earth-shattering. It's just the discipline and rigor to stick to it. So please use the slides. Say, hey, look, these have been vetted by hundreds of folks. This is really what we were trying to achieve, and be diligent about that. And then this last one, this is on Tony, the accuracy thing. It's just, everybody's been there, and it's just absolutely like soul destroying when you didn't catch that one time the new ARR bookings number popped in, and then suddenly there's the same data point on 2 slides, and some board member is clever enough to notice it, and it suddenly just calls the whole exercise and pack into question. And the fact that, oh, that's just a typo, I didn't really it's difficult to get through that. I really, the ability to sort of have that push button and the sort of confidence that all of this stuff is pulling from a data source that you've checked and vetted, and that every time that revenue number, the whole 100 times it appears in that pack, you've got them, as opposed to sort of having the diligence to copy and paste everything. Okay, with that, I want to open up the application and show a little bit about what this looks like to folks. So we'll jump through a couple of things. We'll start kind of in the application, look at some of the sheets that Shoni was talking about, some of the dashboards, the visualizations that hang on top of that, and then we'll end up with what Tony was talking about in terms of the Office Connect plugin that lets you push this out into Excel, Word, and PowerPoint, because that's the format that a lot of board members are going to be consuming this stuff in. So for those of you on the phone that aren't familiar with Adaptive, this may be the first time you're kind of seeing it. I'll kind of orient you a little bit. So we're looking at the sandwich menu here, and we see kind of a set of sheets. These function much like sheets in an Excel workbook. We have different sort of tabs in a workbook. And these sheets are designed to accomplish all the modeling that you typically do in a financial model. So some of what Tony was talking about in terms of all of the different pieces, you can see there's a set of financial statements, a bunch of schedules that we use to arrive at bookings metrics. So things like pipeline and customer database and price times volume and cohorts. because it's an enterprise model, B2B model, we'll oftentimes have a big chunk that's devoted to the sales and sales rep activity. That'll look a little bit different on the consumer side. It'll be likely more of kind of a lead gen and high volume funnel metrics. Bunch of schedules about detailing expenses. So maybe you're looking at software spend or marketing programs or professional services, travel, et cetera. And then importantly, your personnel sheets. So these are going to drive a lot of the headcount metrics. Typically that sales rep metric that Tony was talking about earlier are kind of going to be handled here. And you as a finance and FP&A professional are going to be able to navigate this whole model. But you probably don't want your CEO or even your CFO maybe having to be an expert on all of these things. And so what's typically helpful is to create sort of a KPI sheet. And so that's what I've kind of opened up here. And actually Tony and I undertook this exercise a few years ago to literally go through the company and basically think about, okay, so when we get into a quarterly business review and each of the various departments needs to come up and talk about those metrics, what are those metrics? Define the data definitions that go along with them, and then figure out kind of where that data is going to be coming from. And you can see there's a whole litany of both financial and operational metrics, things down into FTEs, support, services, et cetera. We really kind of span the full gamut of the business. And actually what we're showing here is a somewhat abbreviated version. I've sort of teed up 100 metrics for this demo model. Tony, do you remember where the list sort of topped out in terms of the KPI count that ended up on this sheet?
Yeah, I think, just maybe 200 rows or something like that.
Yeah, 253, I think.
Okay, there you go.
Initial count. But
hey, Tom, as you're getting started, we've had a couple of questions come in.
Sure.
The first one is, what you're showing now, is that the standard package or is that the sales model subscription? And is this example assuming integrations with other external systems?
All great questions. So first off, to broadly address that, Adaptive is a flexible platform, much like Excel, in that you can build and design anything you want. So, what I'm showing here is a sort of a sample set of metrics that might be relevant for, in this case, kind of a high growth software company. Another even some that's directly comparable. Another high growth software company like Malwarebytes would use a sheet that was actually sort of what we flashed earlier. So some of the metrics may be the same, but some of them are different in much the same way as Excel models would differ. The other sort of angle to that question is, and we'll be honest here, there's a bunch of battles you have to fight when you undertake a project like this. One is to figure out what those metrics are, vet them through all of the business owners, but that's kind of the easy part, right? We can create a sheet and a repository here of all the metrics. The hard part is, where does this data come from and how does it get refreshed? And that's some of what Tony was talking about earlier. So, some of that data will be coming from your GL and your ERP, in Tony's case, NetSuite, but can be, Workday or Oracle or SAP or QuickBooks, kind of, wherever that data lives. But then there's a whole lot of other data that is outside that core ERP or GL system that's going to be very important for running your business, from an operations perspective. So your headcount data from your HR system about employees and FTEs, super important to bring in here, and that's what's going to drive something like the FTE numbers down on the bottom. So this data, something like logo count and a lot of the sort of CRM-y type metrics are becoming, in most cases, from Salesforce. So again, another data source. And part of the exercise is figuring out where that data is coming from and then automating the ingestion of that to just make things more efficient. And so Adaptive has a set of an integration framework within Adaptive that lets you ingest data from various sources. So NetSuite, Salesforce, basically, any sort of data source you want to bring in. Thanks for the question, Maeve. Tony, do you want to comment a little on just kind of the undertaking of kind of the effort of vetting those definitions with business owners, and then kind of the discipline around putting the repository together, not so much from the adaptive side, but when you undertook that at malware as well.
Yeah. So just the defining the different metrics is key, because I'm sure we've all been in a meeting where finance puts in some number of 10, and then like 2 seconds later, marketing will be like, oh no, we filter this out and we filter this in, and we come up with a number of 12, and then everyone talks about that for 10 minutes. But the key thing about getting some of these KPIs or metrics in the model is, one, it sort of forces everyone to agree on a definition of a particular metric. So if we want to filter in X, then that's fine, but let's just everyone agree on that. And then so that allows everyone to sort of quote the same number going forward, which is super important and for that consistency and uniformity.
Yeah, no, Tony, absolutely right. So marketing leads. Oh, were you filtering for new opportunities based on operation or opportunity create date, or oh no, I had this filter on from Salesforce, kind of a nightmare. And so being able to lock some of that down and kind of ensure a consistent definition, super important. And then also making sure that hey, when somebody's looking at this in Salesforce, they're actually seeing the same thing that you're quoting and pushing into the board pack. Incredibly important. Okay, so we got the model. You build out this big, holistic, comprehensive model. You tee up, an area in the application where, a CEO or CFO or execs can kind of self-serve and not have to navigate, this whole menu of where all the kind of data lives. And then the value of doing that then is being able to then tee up a set of dashboards that kind of reference back to that information. And so I kind of pulled it up here quickly, but it's called our Discovery dashboards. And that lets you basically build a whole bunch of, sort of visualizations that correspond and are directly connected to that underlying data that we were sort of looking at before, which you can then, drill down into, explore the data, end up back in the particular model that we were looking at before, but one that's fundamentally connected to that underlying data. And that can be incredibly helpful. What we did undertook at Adaptive was literally to go down that list on that KPI sheet and then create a set of visualizations that correspond to that. And that enabled us to kind of throw out a big chunk of the role that finance was playing in terms of aggregating a bunch of slides from different parts of the organization and kind of pulling them into a management pack that folks would kind of run through. And so that's been incredibly helpful in terms of basically cutting out a step. And then what'll happen is when the exec comes into the QBR or the business review, you can actually kind of flip it over into sort of a presentation mode, and they just pop down through a bunch of metrics that are already kind of canned for them. So the exercise becomes one of, hey, make sure the data's in here. Once it's in here, then I can push that out to a chart and a dashboard in kind of a very elegant fashion. And I think one of the important things to sort of appreciate is that this is something that's pretty light and easy to do. So I'm kind of going to mess around a little bit here, but the important part being once the data is done in Adaptive, the creation of charts and visualizations should be an almost a trivial exercise. And so we're looking at a few chart types here. We'll then play around with putting in some data. So we maybe want to show our subscription revenue and our services revenue here, and we can sort of switch that over to a stacked view here, and maybe we want to show the totals. See some totals in there. Change the name. And then my personal favorite in terms of the chart types, the waterfall charts. So for something like OpEx, for example, we have a bunch of child accounts there, and we want to constantly be doing budget versus actual variance analysis. looking at, okay, here was an actual, here was a budget, and kind of tell me about the difference. And in this case, the default is the natural accounts that are sort of children of operating expense, but perhaps I want to switch that around a little bit and instead look at it based on my organization. So I'll switch it over to look at something like, sales and marketing, G&A, R&D, et cetera. And then, here I am done with visualization that then can be shared and is connected back to the underlying data. And particularly these waterfall charts are extraordinarily helpful in terms of explaining variance, right? Because, we put a plan number out there, there's an actual that comes against it, and then the obvious question is like, well, okay, well, tell me about the variance. And this visualization is one that corresponds to that, and it can help facilitate a lot of that description without sort of a huge number of rows in a table and being able to find out like which one is or isn't significant. And so you can kind of have those canned, and it works, not only for OpEx, but fundamentally any metric, right? So maybe I'm looking at leads, and in this case, I'm slicing leads by the different initiatives that we were undertaking, whether that's webinars or events or whatever that are driving leads. Tony, thoughts on the visualization, charts, dashboarding that leads?
Yeah, so I mean, that looks all fantastic. Looks really great, but we just haven't here at Malwarebytes. Again, it's a process, and we haven't done anything on the visualization part within the adaptive model. But we have, like I said earlier, we pull data out of the model and we create charts off those numbers in the Excel Office Connect format.
Yeah, no, totally, and that's actually a great transition. We'll open up Office Connect in a minute and kind of show folks that. So want to highlight there are some nice dashboarding tools and stuff within the application directly, which you can kind of point execs and business owners to kind of let them self-serve. The other mechanism, and this one is particularly helpful for the board because they typically will have some format and a pack that they're used to being emailed, whether that's in PowerPoint or Excel. And so one of the nice things about Adaptive is you can sort of have all the benefit of a single source of truth and a data repository and sort of certainty that your metrics are sort of up to date, but be able to consume it in a form that is more flexible from a formatting perspective, right? So Excel, typically people will already have undertaken this. They'll have a formatted, version of a budget versus actual or a report pack, and what they ultimately want to do is take these numbers and then kind of connect them back to a source. So what I've opened up here is just kind of like regular Excel. You can, type numbers and formulas and, regular kind of Excel with the addition of this plugin called Office Connect. And what that does is let us take kind of a regular old number here and actually link that up back to my adaptive model. So in this case, if I'm looking at sort of total revenue here for December, and I click on a review pane here, it's telling me, hey, this cell, there's kind of more to it. It's not just a number in a I7 here, but that fundamentally there are a bunch of elements that are driving what gets populated into that. And if I click on the little cheat sheet here, all the cells that just got highlighted are actually connected back into my adaptive model. So if I kind of run back over to adaptive real quick and head over to the income statement, and if I go down to sort of December 2018, you can see the subscription services comes to 3.1. And if I pop back over here, the 3.1 element here. And so, as you can imagine, hugely valuable to have this stuff dynamically connected such that when the model changes, you can just sort of refresh it. And so we'll do play around a little bit and show a few examples of kind of what that looks like. So I've built out most of the income statement here, sort of halfway through operating expenses. But let's say I wanted to grab a few more operating expenses to fill out the total there. So if I dig down into my account selector here. See, I've got payroll, taxes, and office expenses. Now I want to bring in travel, entertainment. So if I literally, oh, I don't want to put it right over there. I want to put it right there. So let's drag this one in. And I want to copy it actually across the whole row. So I'll select row. And then if I do the same for marketing, let's just grab that one here, copy into the row. And then lastly, other expense, copy in the row. And then, and what that's done is sort of grab these, accounts, and I can sort of, right now they're the full code here, so maybe we just want to have this be T&E, call this marketing, and then this can just be other. And now what this has done is set up a linkage, and so when I go and click refresh, what this is going to do is go out to my model, back in here, and pull these other elements down into that model. So if I look here and do a quick check, so office travel expense, 8K, and if I go in here, there we go, December, so 8K rounding up to 9 there. And so that I'm comfortable that, hey, this model is directly connected. And then the huge windfall comes, not only just kind of linking these all up the first time, but then, okay, now here we are at the end of Q1, and I want to advance this pack. And so I want the same format, same, data, et cetera, but I want to change the timing on it. And so what we've done here is set up these dates as kind of relative dates, which key off of a workbook property. And so right now, everything's set for the December period. But if I advance this a few months, and go to the end of March, hit OK, and refresh again, what this is going to do is literally pull in all of the data, but in this case, I'm terminating on March. And so, I know that looked like a really quick exercise, but the amount of work and time and energy that saves in terms of an entire pack that's keyed off of a December end date to just be able to kind of advance it one and have the certainty that, hey, my new numbers from March have all pulled in, they're all locked up and correct, is an incredible benefit. And then similarly, I can create a bunch of charts and graphs that feed on top of this, as well as a set of PowerPoint slides, which in this case, would also be kind of linked up here, and we'll kind of skip through that, but you can see the growth metrics here, sales productivity, a bunch of the bookings one, as well as balance, which we sort of use as a proxy for the cost side of things, everything that's touching the expense, FTEs, and then down into cash, set of those metrics. And you can see those all linked up as well, kind of referring back to a similar approach to visualizing and presenting those into the dashboards as well, right? So everything cut up into the growth and balance side, and then a set of charts and graphs that kind of correspond to that. The nice thing being that then the exercise becomes, hey, at the end of the month, when I want to make sure everything's done, it's about tying out the data in here, and then those last miles being able to push it out to a dashboard or push it out to a pack or an Excel file. That all becomes a kind of a push button exercise.
Tom, can you clarify what the green checks and the red X's represent on the Excel version?
Great question. So what is all this nonsense and formatting here? That's just Excel. So we've done a fair bit of work here in terms of taking advantage of some of the formatting tools that Excel has in terms of color coding and checks and the little like trend and spark lines. That's all just raw Excel, and that's one of the real benefits of the plugin. It lets you take advantage of what is a pretty mature and platform that people kind of know how to use, and in most cases have already built out a lot of that infrastructure already. And what they want to do is just link up some of the data. And you can see here actually, there's a few examples. So in this case, the revenue sum here is actually pulling directly, from the model, and it's sort of not doing a sum. You could also do it, sort of the old-fashioned way in Excel, where you just literally, you don't link up the data directly, but are just calculating. I want to pause for a second, and Tony, do you want to talk a little bit about some of what you've built out in terms of pulling this down into Excel and some of the value there?
Yeah, so, I mean, Tom, you basically, you just demonstrated basically what we do with our Office Connect. And the overall, as you were talking, the overall sort of theme or the benefit of all this, of what you demoed is, as a VP of finance or a director of finance, it gives you a level of comfort that that the numbers are, assuming that the numbers in the model, your forecast or your actuals, assuming that those are accurate, and you can have an argument about whether those numbers are good or bad, but at least you have a level of comfort that the numbers that you see in front of you in this Excel screen tie out with the numbers in your model, and it allows you the time, it frees up your time to focus more on the story behind the board pack, which is, that's sort of more important, and sort of, what you're being paid the big bucks for is to put those numbers in context. But at least, again, it gives you a level of confidence that the numbers in the slide at least tie out with the model. Whether those numbers are good, bad, or indifferent is another story.
Yeah, no, great, Tony. We've got a couple of questions piling up here. First off, and I'll put this kind of to Tony because you've sort of had a more recent run at this. What's involved in terms of the time to set this stuff up, both from the model perspective as well as some of the reporting that we were showing in the plugins here?
Yeah, so as far as getting your model up to speed, it took me, a good 2 or 3 months to set it up, and that's with experience with working with Adaptive. So, it might, if you're doing it yourself, it might take a little bit longer. But then on the other side, some of the more mundane tasks when you're setting up your model, you can always use one of the Adaptive partners, which is super helpful. And it takes a little bit of time, but once you sort of get through some of these that initial work, it does pay tremendous benefits on the other side.
Yeah, Tony, good point. I think something that's worth underscoring for folks is, and we're showing a fairly mature and comprehensive model here, for example, where you have, all 3 financial statements of, bookings, sales capacity, a bunch of expense schedules, personnel, et cetera. A lot of folks will start with, hey, maybe just OpEx and headcount and maybe just the P&L to get going. And then I circle back as a phase 2 build out forward balance sheet that gets me cash flow. And then I think about tackling some of the bookings measures and bringing sales into the process. So you can certainly phase some of that build out, but it's much like, an initial model build from an Excel perspective as well. Do you want to talk a little bit, Tony, in terms of the reporting side? So the time to build out those, and we showed a little bit of it in dashboards and a little bit in Office Connect, what that sort of entails. But do you want to talk about that?
Sure. So as far as reporting, again, all these, 90+% of our board reporting is coming from Adaptive. So it's, and we're pulling it through Office Connect. So it's helpful to create that sort of one KPI sheet, so that when you pull a number in Office Connect and it says $10 million, that it ties out with your KPI sheet. That's super helpful when you're building an Office Connect model. But as far as taking this view in Excel to your board pack, we just do like a little bit of a copy paste exercise to transfer what you see on the screen into a PowerPoint file.
Thanks, John. We had another question here about dimensionality, which is a great one, about, hey, can I pull in different filters on this, and how would that work, and what would that look like? So again, the example here, we just kind of were top level P&L kind of thing. But if I kind of scroll down a little bit and just, down towards the bottom here, if I wanted to say grab, and the short answer is yes, and you can basically pull into this report, both here and also on the dashboard, the full dimensionality and access to everything that you have in your model. And so while I'm maybe pulling an account here to start, let's maybe just new logos, and I want to pull that onto select a row first. Sorry, there we go. And so if I pull new logos in there, for example, then I can pull also any sort of filter attribute that I have on top of that. So new logos, perhaps is filtered by product, and maybe I want just product 1 in this case. So I can add that to any of these. Apply it to the row. And then when I refresh that, it's going to pull not only that data, but also it's filtered. So maybe I didn't have logos for that particular product, and so it's giving me an error, but you get the idea. Similarly, I can filter it for any sort of level or piece of the organization. So, all of my data that I was pulling in that P&L was kind of the high level, but I could similarly filter it to just grab office expenses for the sales organization, so on and so forth. And then all of that same dimensionality is available within the dashboarding as well. So, when I have a particular metric here, let's, by function, I can, filter this by any sort of dimension or level, et cetera. So great question.
Hey, Tom, I got a couple more about Office Connect.
Sure.
I'm going to throw 3 at you. Is Office Connect an additional cost? Is there Office Connect for Word as well as Excel and PowerPoint? And does Office Connect retain the security of Excel, where you can use a password protect for editing purposes?
So let's start at the bottom. In terms of security, yes, and it's actually, so you have all the same Excel functionality, but you have added functionality of the same security measures that you have in Adaptive. You also persist into Office Connect. And so what I mean by that is if, I'm, for example, the marketing manager and I only have access to a particular portion of the model, marketing, for example, that access will persist into Office Connect. So when I try to go pull data, it'll be filtered just for my availability. You can, now with Office Connect, you can intentionally circumvent that. So for example, in this report here, I could pull this whole company data because I am the admin and I have access to it. The numbers are then just dead numbers, and I can sort of send that file out to other folks. And so I could, there may be situations where I want to circumvent that to distribute KPIs, et cetera. If we work back up the chain there.
So Office Connect for Word.
Word and PowerPoint, yes. So the plugins for Word and PowerPoint work kind of the same way. They actually use what are called named ranges in Excel. So the data populates in through Excel and then pushes into Word or PowerPoint. And actually, you can also do interesting things with like automating some of the MD&A analysis. So you can wire up, for example, a cell to look at a variance here, and if the variance is negative, you can have it say increase and decrease and so on and so forth. Any part of that question?
The first question, sorry, is Office Connect an additional cost?
Additional charge. Yes, of course. Anything that's worth having is worth paying for. But I think that this is broadly true of most of the reporting capabilities in Adaptive, which is if you've gone through the work of building out a comprehensive and holistic model on the Adaptive side, you're crazy not to spend the money to benefit from the reporting, because that's where you pick up an enormous amount of time savings. I mean, the ability to just hit, push forward a month and have my board pack be done is something that, I would pay us, I struggle to think what I wouldn't pay to enable that. But it's actually, check with the reps that they can give you kind of a quote on what it is. Tony, comments on the value of reporting?
Yeah, super
Would you ever
important.
buy Adaptive without the reporting?
No, absolutely not.
Okay.